Well, good evening. Welcome to Grover Hill Zion United Methodist Church Thursday evening devotions from around the kitchen table. Hope you're enjoying this beautiful weather. Wow, just a lovely day out there. And the old flowers are just popped right out today. They just seem to keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Well, I don't normally watch the news. You know, I've shared that with you before. I don't like the news. It's just, it's nothing, it's just real negative, and it's just a repeat of everything they said the day before, 24 hours a day. It'll get you upset if you watch that stuff. And you'll get to thinking about things that aren't really true, because those newscasters, that's how they make their living. However, last night I did turn it on for a few minutes to just see what they were talking about, which is against my principles to watch that stuff, but I did. And wow, it just sounded like the whole world is collapsing. It just seems like corruption is everywhere, doesn't it? Violence, because that's all they show you, for one. And yet it seems like things are just so chaotic out there, and yet I firmly believe that most people, or at least the people I get around, and there are people from all races and many different cultures, they seem to get along. Everybody that I encounter seems to just want to live their life in peace with everyone else. However, our elected officials in a number of places, and it only takes a few just to give a bad impression. Our elected officials, when violence happens in some places, they just look the other way. They release the criminals, and there doesn't appear to be any punishment for it, and they're free to go out and recommit their whatever it is they're craving for to do violence and wrong is. And so they do that, and they wreak havoc on society, because prosecutors and other folks just don't want to deal with them. And yet they're violating their oath. But anyway, I don't want to dwell on that. And I thought, well, all this violence and all this wrongdoing and all this corruption and sin, it's kind of been that way since the beginning, hasn't it? Goes clear back into Adam and Eve, when Adam and Eve sinned against God in the garden. Humanity has really been a pain, if you will, and caused God a lot of problems. And God loves humanity anyway. He loves human beings anyway. He loves His creation anyway. No matter how much of a problem we are with Him, He just wants us to follow His ways and not our own. And so when I look around and I see all that violence that they're broadcasting about in the news, I take a look at the signs of the times, the signs of the end times. And when you read the scriptures, it just seems like they're appearing everywhere. Now, a lot of these things have always been. It's just today in our society it's more noticeable, because we have all this technology, and we can watch all this stuff in real time, just as quickly as it happens. We can watch it. Where up until today, sometimes even when I was growing up, it took news a long time to get around to the people. Used to be you had 30 minutes of news in the evening, and that was it until 11 o'clock at night. Today you got 24 hours a day, and so they have to fill their newscast or their programming with something. So they go out of their way to create things. But just to get back to my mentioning, or my point about corruption and violence has always been. Let me just share with you what the Apostle Paul wrote to Timothy. Timothy was a young pastor, and he's trying to give him some peace, give Timothy some peace, and to relieve his anxious moments. And Paul writes, "Mark this, though in those last days there'll be terrible times in those last days, because people will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money. They'll be boastful and proud and abusive and disobedient to their parents. They'll be ungrateful and unholy, without love, unforgiving, slanderous, without self-control, not lovers of good. They'll just be brutal, be self-centered. And that's enough. There's more to that list, but I don't want to dwell on that. And some will come even claiming that they're God, Well, we see that among some of the dictators today. They've had the people declare them to be God. Well, they did that back in Egypt and other times as well. And again, Paul writes in 2 Corinthians, don't let anybody ever deceive you in any way, for that day will not come until the rebellion occurs and the man of lawlessness appears. And he will oppose and will exalt himself over everything that is called God or is worshipped, so that he sets himself up in God's temple, proclaiming himself to be God himself. Well, we see that a lot, don't we? Jeremiah writes in Jeremiah chapter 32 that they built high altars for Baal, who was a pagan god, in the valley of Ben Hinnom, to sacrifice their sons and daughters. Yeah, I say they sacrificed their sons and daughters to Moloch, who, again, was another false god. But they threw them in the fire, their firstborn. And then God continues to tell Jeremiah, I never commanded that. I didn't want that. I never commanded that at all. Nor did it ever enter my mind that they would do such detestable things to make Judah sin. Well, perhaps we don't throw our sons and daughters in the fire today. We're more sophisticated, right? We just tear them from the mother's womb. We just chop them up through this process called abortion. We slaughter these babies before they're ever born. Well, depending on your outlook, I don't see much difference in that. And Paul goes, or this is John writing in 1 John chapter 2 about just who is the liar. To do those things, I think you have to do all those things that Paul mentioned in Jeremiah. I think that you have to ignore God as well. And so John writes, 1 John chapter 2, who is the liar? It is whoever denies that Jesus is the Christ. Such a person is the Antichrist, denying the Father and the Son. No one who denies the Son has the Father, and whoever acknowledges the Son has the Father also. It's said that to honor the Son is to honor the Father. Think about that. And then Paul writes again in his letter to the Romans, the first chapter. And he writes that the wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all godliness and against all wickedness, who suppress and those who suppress the truth by their wickedness, since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power, and his divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. People have no excuse. They should have known that there is God, no matter what. And then he goes on and said, listen, Paul writes, listen, they have no excuse, for although they knew God or they knew about God, they neither glorified him nor did they give thanks to him. They went on about their foolish ways, and so their hearts were darkened. They claimed to be wise, but they became fools, and they exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like mere humans or birds or animals or reptiles. And so then God goes on to say, he goes on to say, God gave them over to the sinful desires of their hearts and of their minds, to sexual impurity for the degrading of their bodies with one another. They exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshipped and served created things rather than the Creator, who is forever praised. Because God gave them over to shameful lust, even their women exchanged natural relations or natural sexual relations for unnatural ones. And in the same way, men also abandoned natural sexual relations with women and were inflamed with lust for one another. Men committed shameful acts with other men. Shameful. And then he goes on to say, listen, they are full of envy and murder and strife and deceit, and they're gossips and slanderers and God haters. Same kind of a list that I mentioned earlier. And then in Leviticus chapter 20, Moses writes, if a man practices homosexuality, having sex with another man as with a woman, both men have committed a detestable act. So when we look out there and we see all this junk, if you will, all this stuff that is ungodly, and we think, wow, our world is really going down. It's been like that for a very long time. I'm not excusing that at all, nor trivializing it. It's just that God is in charge, or God is in charge, and He is still in control, and He will one day take control. And lastly, Paul writes in that first chapter of Romans, verse 16, after seeing all this stuff around him, he said, listen, for those who reject God, he writes, I am not ashamed of the gospel, because it is the power of God, and it brings salvation to everyone who believes, first to the Jew and then to the Gentile. For in the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed. Righteousness that is by faith, from first to last, just as it is written, the righteous will live by faith. The righteous will live by faith. Take a look at what's happening around you. Remember, matters not what somebody else is doing, but it matters about your righteousness and your faith. The righteous will live by faith. Don't copy the world, but follow Jesus. Well, God bless you and have a great and blessed week.